So if anyone wants to know why I was holding up a Robert E. Lee statue in my last video, see Robert E. Lee, is because about 9 years ago I went to Stratford Hall, the home where Robert E. Lee was born. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because a lot of people have used Trump's what seems to be a compliment of Robert E. Lee, which he is a man who deserves compliments. The liberal media has taken it out of context to make it seem that Donald Trump is a racist. Robert E. Lee was not racist. Robert E. Lee was a West Point graduate, a very good general that Lincoln tried to get to come to his side. Robert E. Lee did not want the Civil War. He was against war until it was inevitable. And then he said he wanted to remain neutral. But he also wanted to defend his family in Virginia. He wanted to defend his home. And that's how he was dragged into the Civil War. So he went to defend his home. Now, how many of you, if your home state were under attack, how many of you would go home to defend it, whether you agreed with the attackers or not? How many of you would go home and defend your home, defend your family, knowing that your family would be attacked in their homes by these attackers and raped and God knows what else? How many of you would defend your family? Because if you said you will, then you have no room to judge Robert E. Lee. I am a fan of the Lees. And before I get off on a tangent about the Lee family, Donald Trump was actually bringing up Lee in Ohio to compliment Ulysses S. Grant, who was from Ohio. So he was actually kind of going around and doing the compliment of Ulysses S. Grant. So there you go. Now, getting back to the Lee family, I am a fan of the Lee family. So going back to why I was at Stratford Hall 9 years ago was because I wanted to learn more about my favorite Lee, who lived at Stratford Hall in the 18th century. His name was Richard Henry Lee. Richard Henry Lee is well known for his role in 1776, right? The Lees of Virginia. Okay, that was not how he really was. But that's how a lot of kids know Robert E. Lee, unfortunately. Robert E. Lee was a representative from Virginia to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Virginia was the first colony to declare independency in writing and pass legislation, making us an independent state, basically. They then wrote legislation, sent it to Philadelphia, where Richard Henry Lee presented it to the Continental Congress on June 7, 1776. That's the legislation. They delayed voting on that legislation for 3 weeks because there was, where once it had to be a majority vote, now they needed unanimity. And so they delayed the vote to try and get unanimity. In the meantime, the Declaration of Independence is being drafted by Thomas Jefferson and 4 other men from 4 different colonies. So that's why I like Robert E. Lee and the fact that his family has contributed a lot to the forming of this country, which is probably another reason why Robert E. Lee did not want to go to war against the country that his family was very active in forming. And the Lee women in the 18th century wanted women to have a voice in government, wanted women to have the right to vote or the privilege to vote. Because in the 18th century, voting was a privilege, it wasn't a right. But they wanted women to have that same privilege. The women also in the Lee family were considered in their time to be progressive, or what liberals would think they are. After the Nat Turner Rebellion, an educated slave organized a revolt. It was not illegal to educate your slaves. Well, after this educated slave was able to organize a somewhat successful revolt, scared enough of these Democrats in the South, these slave owners, that they passed a law that you could no longer educate your slaves. Well, the Lee women went against that rule, and they were still educating their enslaved people. So the Lee family is actually a family worth looking up and looking into, because they're not the monsters and the boogeymen that the left wing would have you believe. Yes, they own slaves. They are people of their time. Sorry, I'm looking off at the screen. Again, all of the violence in Portland just over this past weekend is playing all over my screen. These clowns. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to talk about is, I believe next week there's a witch gathering in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I'm not going. I'm not going because these witches are Satanists. Not that I find much wrong with Satanists. Now, you can do what you want to do. The thing that I find hypocritical about these witches, okay, is that, hey, I know that guy. He's the head of Patriot Prayer. I know him. I can't remember his name, but I've met him before. Anyway, Patriot Prayer had a march in Portland, very peaceful, and Antifa showed up and started pepper spraying people and fighting people like my friend on the screen. Joey Gibson, that's his name. Yes, hey, Joey! I know you. Very nice man, very handsome in person, too. Getting back to the witches. Yes, so the witches are going to D.C. to hex Kavanaugh. Now, the witches have been hexing Trump for years. Well, at least since 2015. Okay, in New York and D.C., they're having their chanting circles and they're burning candles and they're hexing Trump. The only thing is, Trump is very successful. Maybe the only thing they're affecting are his poll numbers, which are in the mid to high 40s. Given that 98% of the news on Trump is negative, I'd say that's a positive. Anyway, so the witches are going to D.C. to hex Trump. Okay, now, if you know anything about the craft, the first rule of the craft is harm none. Okay? The other rule of Wicca and paganism and white witchcraft is that you cannot put your will over another person. You cannot force your will over the will of another person, because that is no longer white magic, that's black magic. Black magic is imposing your will upon another person, i.e. causing a person to fall in love with you. Okay? Love spells, revenge spells, stuff like that. Well, a hexing is a revenge spell. They're not binding, right? Do no harm by binding someone? No, they're hexing. So they're not doing a binding spell, they're doing a hexing spell. And so they're violating the rule of do no harm and the rule of 3. What you put out into the universe comes back to you threefold. And it doesn't just come back to hit you, it comes back to hit the people around you, the people that you love. So while they might not be experiencing their karma, their loved ones will be, you see. And so they're not very smart occultists, or they just don't care or something. Because real Wiccans, real witches, real pagans, real people who practice white magic would not engage in what they're engaging in. So they're just not very good occultists. That, or maybe Trump just has better occultists and better witches on his side. I don't know. For every hexing spell and every binding spell can be a spell of protection. So that, and the Christian God is very strong. They've been conquering the world for centuries. The only religion they can't conquer, it seems, is Muslims. Although my hero Vlad the Impaler did the best he could. Anyway, so that's my thought about the witches and Robert E. Lee. Wow, I talked about the Civil War, the Lee family, Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence, and witches in one video in under 10 minutes. Who else could do that? All right, everyone, I gotta go. It's almost 3 o'clock in the morning here. I got another 12-hour shift tomorrow, so I'm out. Hey, Joey. Patriot Prayer, peaceful. They always get attacked by Antifa, the haters, the violent haters of the left.